Abigail May Callahan stood in the middle of Silver Creek's main street, holding a pie tin with both hands, sweat rolling down her temple, and a cowboy's laughter cutting through the summer heat like a whip. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She looked that man dead in the eye and said, "If my size offends you, sir, don't taste my food." Then she set that pie down in front of the most respected rancher in the territory and walked away without looking back. What happened next silenced the whole town. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The pie tin was still warm when she set it down. Abigail May Callahan placed it on the edge of the wooden rail outside the saloon, right where the dust settled thick and the laughter hadn't stopped yet. Her fingers trembled, but she pressed them flat against her apron and kept her chin up. The cowboy, some trail hand she'd never seen before, leaned against the hitching post and grinned like he'd just won a hand of poker. "You hear me, sweetheart?" he said, loud enough for the whole street to catch it. "I asked if you're planning to feed the cattle or eat the profits yourself." 3 men on the porch laughed. A woman across the street turned her head, not in sympathy, in agreement. Abigail felt the heat rise up her neck, not from the sun, from something older. Something she'd carried since she was 12 years old, and her own mother told her no man would ever look twice at a girl built like a feed sack. But she didn't shrink. She looked at the cowboy and said, calm as creek water, "I didn't ask for your opinion, sir. I asked if anyone wanted pie." The cowboy opened his mouth to say something else, but a voice from the end of the rail cut through. "I'll take a piece." Ezekiel Turner stood 6 feet 2 inches of silence. He didn't smile. He didn't look at the cowboy. He just reached for the tin, pulled a fork from his vest pocket, the kind a man carries when he's been eating alone on the trail for years, and cut into the crust. The whole street went quiet. Not because Zeke was angry, because Zeke never spoke unless it mattered. And the fact that he was standing there, in front of the saloon, cutting into a fat woman's pie, that mattered. He chewed slow. He didn't look up. Then he set the fork down and said to nobody in particular, "That's the best thing I've tasted since my wife died." The cowboy stopped laughing. Abigail didn't move. She stood there, hands still pressed against her apron, and felt something crack inside her chest. Not from sadness, but from the shock of being seen. Zeke looked at her for the first time. "You got a name?" he asked. "Abigail Callahan," she said. "Most folks call me Abby." "Abby," he said, like he was testing the weight of it. "You looking for work?" She stared at him. "Depends on the work. I need a cook. Summer cattle drive starts in 9 days. 12 men, 6 weeks on the trail. Pays fair. Works hard." "I ain't afraid of hard work, Mr. Turner." "Didn't say you were." He picked up the pie tin and handed it back to her. "You think about it. I'll be at the ranch." Then he turned and walked down the street without another word. The cowboy on the porch watched him go and muttered, "He's gone soft." Abigail heard it. She picked up her pie tin, tucked it under her arm, and walked the other direction. She didn't look back. Not once. The boarding house on Mill Street smelled like boiled cabbage and regret. Abigail climbed the stairs to her room, 2nd floor, end of the hall, smallest room in the building, and sat down on the edge of the bed. The springs groaned under her weight. They always did. She'd stopped being embarrassed by the sound 3 towns ago. She set the pie tin on the nightstand and stared at it. Half the pie was gone. Zeke had taken 1 slice. The rest she'd sold that morning to the dry goods store for 30 cents. 30 cents for 4 hours of work. 30 cents that wouldn't cover another week's rent. She opened the small leather journal she kept in her apron pocket and counted the money she had left. $4.12. That was everything. Every cent she'd saved since leaving Missouri. Every penny from every pie, every loaf, every pot of stew she'd sold on the road. $4 wouldn't get her to the next town. Wouldn't get her a ticket on the stage. Wouldn't buy her another week in this room. She closed the journal and pressed her hands together. "Lord," she whispered, "I ain't asking for much. Just a place where my hands are worth more than my shape." A knock came at the door. She wiped her eyes fast. Not that she'd been crying, she told herself, and opened it. Mrs. Pearson, the boarding house owner, stood in the hallway with her arms crossed. Thin woman, sharp nose, the kind of face that looked like it had been pressed between the pages of a Bible and left there too long. "Miss Callahan," she said, "I need to speak with you." "Yes, ma'am?" "I've had complaints." Abigail felt her stomach tighten. "Complaints about what?" "About the smell. You've been cooking in your room again." "I baked one pie this morning, Mrs. Pearson, on the windowsill. I didn't use the stove." "The other tenants don't appreciate it." Abigail looked at her. "Which tenants?" Mrs. Pearson didn't answer that. Instead, she said, "I also need to let you know that your rent is due Friday. If you can't pay, I'll need the room by Saturday morning." "I understand. And Miss Callahan, I'd appreciate it if you kept to yourself. Some of the ladies in town have expressed concern about your presence in certain establishments." Abigail felt the words land like stones. She knew exactly what certain establishments meant. It meant the saloon. It meant the general store. It meant anywhere a woman her size dared to stand in public and take up space. "I sell pies, Mrs. Pearson. That's all I do." "I'm sure it is." The woman's mouth thinned. "Friday, Miss Callahan." The door closed. Abigail sat back down on the bed and stared at the wall. $4.12. 9 days until the cattle drive. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she was standing outside Zeke Turner's ranch before the sun cleared the ridge. The place was bigger than she'd expected. A wide, low house with a wraparound porch. Barn to the left, corral to the right. Dust everywhere, but the kind of dust that comes from work, not neglect. A man came out of the barn, carrying a saddle over one shoulder. Young, maybe 22. Red hair, freckles. The kind of face that smiled easy and thought slow. He stopped when he saw her. "Help you?" he said. "I'm looking for Mr. Turner." The young man looked her up and down. Not mean exactly, but not kind either. The way people look at something they don't expect to see in a place like this. "He's in the house," the young man said. "You the pie lady?" "I'm the cook," Abigail said. He raised an eyebrow. "That's so." "That's so." He set the saddle on the fence rail and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Name's Tommy, Tommy Red. I ride for Mr. Turner." "Abigail Callahan." "Well, Miss Callahan," Tommy said, and there was something in his voice she didn't like. "I hope you can handle the heat. Trail cooking ain't the same as selling pies in town." "I reckon I can handle whatever needs handling, Mr. Red." Tommy grinned. Not a friendly grin. The kind that says, "We'll see about that." She walked past him and up to the porch. The front door was open. She knocked on the frame. "Mr. Turner?" Footsteps, heavy boots on wooden floor. Zeke appeared in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, hat already on. He looked at her the same way he'd looked at the pie, like he was measuring something most people couldn't see. "You thought about it," he said. "I did." "And?" "I'll take the job, but I have conditions." Something flickered in his eyes. Not annoyance, curiosity. "Go ahead." "I cook what I cook. Nobody tells me how much salt to use or how thin to cut the biscuits. I wake before the crew and I eat after they're done. And nobody touches my supplies without asking." Zeke took a sip of coffee. "Anything else?" "Yes. I sleep in the supply wagon. Not on the ground with the men. That's reasonable. And I get paid same as any hand. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. You know most trail cooks get half. Most trail cooks ain't me, Mr. Turner. A pause, long enough for the wind to move dust across the porch. Then Zeke said, Full pay. You start tomorrow. Be here before dawn. He didn't shake her hand. He didn't smile. He just turned and walked back inside. Abigail stood on that porch for a long moment, feeling the sun on her back and something unfamiliar in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it. Hope. She hadn't felt it in a long time. Word traveled fast in Silver Creek. By noon, half the town knew that Zeke Turner had hired the fat pie woman for the cattle drive. By supper, the other half had opinions about it. Abigail walked to the general store to buy supplies: flour, lard, salt, coffee, dried beans, and felt the stairs before she even reached the door. Inside, two women stood near the fabric bolts, whispering. They stopped when Abigail walked in, then started again the moment she turned her back. She heard the words clearly enough. Shameless. Throwing herself at a widower. A woman that size has no business on a cattle drive. Abigail set her basket on the counter and waited for Mr. Dawson, the shopkeeper, to total her order. He did, slowly, like he was doing her a favor. That'll be $2.40, he said. She counted out the coins. It left her with $1.72. You sure about this, Miss Callahan? Mr. Dawson said, and his voice carried the particular kindness of a man who felt sorry for someone but wouldn't lift a finger to help. Sure about what? The drive. It's rough country. Rough men. I appreciate the concern, Mr. Dawson, but I've been in rough places before. He shrugged. Suit yourself. She picked up her supplies and turned for the door. That's when Clarissa Bloom stepped in. Clarissa was the wife of Harold Bloom, who owned the mercantile and the feed store and half the rental properties in Silver Creek. She wore her husband's money like armor. Silk dress, pearl earrings, hair pinned so tight it pulled her eyebrows up into a permanent expression of mild disgust. She looked at Abigail the way a woman looks at a stain on a white tablecloth. Miss Callahan, Clarissa said, with a smile that never reached her eyes. I heard the news. Ma'am, you must be so grateful to Mr. Turner. Not many men would take such a risk. Abigail gripped the flour sack tighter. I don't follow. Well, Clarissa said, and her voice dropped to the sweet, poisonous register of a woman who'd perfected cruelty without ever raising her tone. Hiring someone of your stature for a cattle drive. That's quite charitable. The two women by the fabric bolts watched with the hungry eyes of spectators at a dogfight. Abigail looked at Clarissa Bloom and felt the old familiar weight press down on her chest. The weight of every room she'd walked into where people calculated her worth by the width of her hips. The weight of every man who'd looked past her. Every woman who'd stepped aside. Every whisper she was never supposed to hear, but always did. She could have said something sharp. She could have defended herself. She could have told Clarissa Bloom that charity had nothing to do with it, that she'd earned the job with her own two hands, that her food was worth more than anything in Harold Bloom's overpriced mercantile. But she didn't, because she'd learned a long time ago that defending yourself to people who've already decided your worth is just giving them more ammunition. So she said, "Good day, Mrs. Bloom," and walked out the door. The sun hit her face, and she kept walking, straight back to the boarding house, up the stairs, into the room. She set the supplies on the floor, sat on the bed, and pressed her hands together until her knuckles turned white. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in 3 years, not since the day she'd stood in front of a church in Abilene and heard a preacher tell her that gluttony was a sin and her body was proof of God's displeasure. She'd walked out of that church and hadn't cried since. But sitting on that bed in Silver Creek, with Clarissa Bloom's voice still ringing in her ears, and $1.72 to her name, and a job that might be the last chance she'd ever get, she came close. She came real close. Then she stood up, tied her apron tight, and started organizing her supplies. Because Abigail May Callahan had learned one thing in 27 years of being the biggest woman in every room she entered. Tears don't rise dough. And she had biscuits to plan. She arrived at the ranch before dawn, just like Zeke said. The sky was still purple-black when she pulled her small wagon up to the cook station. A flat patch of ground between the bunkhouse and the barn, with an iron fire ring, a work table made from sawhorses and planks, and a chuck wagon that looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned since the last cook quit. She cleaned it, scrubbed every surface, organized the drawers, hung her pots, set her cast iron skillet, the one thing she'd carried from Missouri, the one thing that had belonged to her grandmother, over the fire, and started coffee before any man on the ranch was awake. By the time the crew stumbled out of the bunkhouse, blinking against the early light, the smell of biscuits and bacon and strong black coffee hung in the air like a promise. 12 men, all of them stopped when they saw her. She saw the calculations happen in real time. The looks, the elbowed ribs, the smirks bitten back. Tommy Red was the first to speak. He leaned against the bunkhouse door, arms crossed. "Well, boys," he said, loud enough for her to hear, "looks like we got ourselves a real kitchen queen." A few men laughed. Abigail didn't look up. She flipped a biscuit, poured coffee into a tin cup, and set it on the end of the table. "Breakfast is ready," she said. "Eat it or don't." The men looked at each other, then at the food, then at Tommy, who shrugged and walked over first, because even a man who wants to be cruel isn't fool enough to skip a hot meal on a work morning. He picked up a biscuit, bit into it, and stopped chewing. Abigail watched from the corner of her eye. She'd seen that look before. The look of a person whose mouth has just received information their brain hasn't processed yet. Tommy swallowed, looked at the biscuit, looked at her. "That ain't bad," he said. "I know," she said. He grabbed a plate and sat down. One by one the others followed. Nobody thanked her. Nobody looked her in the eye. But every plate came back empty. Abigail washed the dishes alone while the men saddled up. She could hear them talking by the corral. She couldn't make out every word, but she caught enough. Can she keep up? Ain't natural, a woman that size on the trail. Zeke must be desperate. She scrubbed harder. Zeke came out of the house just as the last pot was drying. He walked to the cook station, looked at the setup, the cleaned wagon, the organized supplies, the fire burning clean and even, and said nothing for a long time. Then he picked up a leftover biscuit from the warming rack, took a bite, and nodded. "You'll do," he said. 2 words. But from Ezekiel Turner, that was a sermon. He mounted his horse and rode out with the crew. Abigail stood alone in the quiet morning, the fire crackling, the prairie stretching out in every direction, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope this time. Something steadier. Purpose. She had 9 days to prove herself before the drive. 9 days of feeding men who didn't want her there. 9 days of earning a place that nobody believed she deserved. She rolled up her sleeves, wiped her hands on her apron, and got to work. Because the only language these men understood was action. And Abigail May Callahan was done talking. 9 days. That's what Abigail told herself every morning when she woke before the stars faded. 9 days to prove she wasn't a charity case. 9 days to make 12 men forget the size of her body and remember the taste of her food. Day 1, they ignored her. Day 2, they talked about her like she wasn't standing 10 feet away. Day 3, Tommy Red decided to test her. He came to the cook station at midday, sweat soaking through his shirt, and dropped a tin plate on the work table hard enough to rattle the coffee pot. "Stew's cold," he said. Abigail looked at the plate. The stew wasn't cold. She'd ladled it fresh not 5 minutes ago. She could still see the steam curling off the surface. "Then eat faster," she said. Tommy leaned in. I said it's cold. You deaf or just slow?" The two hands sitting nearby, older men named Polk and Gideon, stopped eating. They didn't intervene. They just watched, the way men do when they want to see how far something goes, before they decide whose side they're on. Abigail picked up the plate, walked to the fire, and held it over the flame with her bare hand wrapped in a rag. She counted to 10. Then she set it back down in front of Tommy. "Hot enough?" she asked. Tommy stared at her, his jaw tightened. She could see him calculating, not the temperature of the stew, but whether a woman like her was allowed to talk to him like that. "You got a mouth on you," he said. "I got 2 hands in a fire, Mr. Red. You want to eat, or you want to argue?" Polk coughed into his cup. Might have been a laugh, hard to tell. Tommy grabbed the plate and walked away without another word. Abigail went back to chopping onions. Her hand was shaking, but she held the knife steady. She'd learned that trick years ago. When your body wants to tremble, give it something to do. That night, she lay in the supply wagon and stared at the canvas ceiling and replayed the moment 17 times. Each time, she imagined saying something different, something sharper, something that would have made Tommy Red shrink the way he tried to make her shrink. But that wasn't the game. The game was endurance. She knew that. She'd been playing it her whole life. By day 4, something shifted. Not big, not obvious, but real. Gideon, the oldest hand on the ranch, a man with a gray beard and hands like leather gloves, came to the cook station after supper and set his empty plate down gently. Not dropped. Set. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Mr. Gideon?" "That cornbread tonight." He paused, worked his jaw like the words were stuck sideways. "My wife used to make it like that. Same recipe, near enough." Abigail looked at him. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. Men like Gideon didn't cry. They just carried the water inside and let it rust them from within. "Where's your wife now?" she asked softly. "Cholera, winter of '69. "I'm sorry." He nodded, picked up his hat, put it back on. "Just wanted to say, that's all." He walked away. Abigail stood at the work table for a long time after that, her hands flat on the wood, feeling the grain beneath her palms. She understood something in that moment that she hadn't fully grasped before. She wasn't just feeding bodies. She was feeding memory. She was feeding the part of these men that had gone hungry for years, not for food, but for something that tasted like being cared for. And that was a power nobody could take from her, no matter how much they laughed. Day 5 brought Clarissa Bloom to the ranch. Abigail heard the buggy before she saw it. The crisp snap of a whip on a horse that didn't need whipping. The rattle of wheels on a road meant for work wagons, not silk-cushioned seats. Clarissa stepped down from the buggy like she was descending from a throne. She wore a blue dress with white lace trim and carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She walked straight past Abigail without a glance and up to the porch where Zeke was mending a bridle. "Mr. Turner," Clarissa said, her voice carrying that practiced sweetness. "I brought preserves. Thought you could use something proper for your table." Zeke didn't look up. "Appreciate it, Mrs. Bloom." "I also wanted to discuss the church social next month. The committee needs your support. Your late wife was such a pillar of the—" "I'll think on it," Zeke said, and his voice closed like a gate. Clarissa paused. Then she turned, slowly, deliberately, and looked at Abigail. "Oh," she said, "you are still here." "Yes, ma'am." "How wonderful." Clarissa walked toward the cook station, heels clicking on the hard-packed dirt. She looked at the organized supplies, the clean pots, the neatly stacked firewood. She looked at all of it the way a person looks at a room they're measuring for furniture that hasn't been delivered yet. "You know," Clarissa said, keeping her voice just low enough that Zeke might not hear from the porch, but just loud enough that Abigail couldn't pretend she didn't. "People in town are talking. A single woman? Living on a man's ranch? It doesn't look right." "I sleep in the supply wagon, Mrs. Bloom, and I work for wages." "Of course you do," Clarissa smiled. "But you understand how it looks. A woman of your proportions. People wonder what a man like Zeke Turner could possibly see in, well..." She let the sentence hang like a noose. "I'm sure your cooking is adequate." Abigail felt the heat rise from her belly to her throat. She gripped the handle of her cast-iron skillet, her grandmother's skillet, and held on. "Is there something you need, Mrs. Bloom?" she asked. "Because I got supper to start." Clarissa laughed. Light, musical, cruel.
"I'm just looking out for you, dear. Small towns have long memories. You don't want to be remembered as the woman who took advantage of a grieving man." She picked up her empty basket, turned on her heel, and walked back to her buggy. She didn't say goodbye to Zeke. She didn't need to. She'd done what she came to do. Abigail watched the buggy disappear down the road and felt the words settle into her like splinters. Small, invisible, and impossible to pull out. That evening, she burned the biscuits. First time in 4 years. She stood over the fire, staring at the blackened bottoms, and wanted to scream. Not because of the biscuits, because Clarissa Bloom had gotten inside her head and rearranged the furniture, and Abigail hated that it still worked. After everything, after every town, after every whisper and stare and casual cruelty disguised as concern, it still worked. She scraped the biscuits into the fire and started over. Zeke came to the cook station late that night. The crew had turned in. The fire was low. Abigail was kneading dough for the morning, her arms covered in flour up to the elbows, working the dough like she was trying to push something out of it that had no business being there. He sat down on the bench across from her and set his hat on the table. "Mrs. Bloom visit you today?" he asked. Abigail didn't stop kneading. "She visited the ranch. I just happened to be on it." "What'd she say?" "Nothing worth repeating." Zeke watched her hands, the rhythm of them. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. The steady violence of making something soft. "Clarissa Bloom talks because silence terrifies her," he said. "She fills every room with words so she doesn't have to sit with herself." Abigail looked up. "That's supposed to comfort me?" "No, it's supposed to tell you she ain't worth burning biscuits over." She stopped kneading. "You noticed that?" "I notice most things." A long silence. The fire popped. Somewhere in the dark, a horse shuffled in the corral. "Mr. Turner," Abigail said, "why'd you hire me? And I don't want to hear about pie. I want the truth." Zeke picked up his hat, turned it in his hands, put it back down. "My wife, Eleanor. She was a tall woman, thin, beautiful, people said. Every Sunday after church, women told her how lucky she was, how pretty, how perfect." He paused. She hated it. Said they only saw the outside, and the outside was the least interesting part of her. He looked at Abigail. "When I tasted your pie, I didn't see a fat woman standing in the street. I saw someone who put her whole self into a piece of food and dared people to judge it. That's rare. That's worth hiring." Abigail's hands stilled on the dough. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. 3 years, he said. Fever took her fast. 1 week she was hanging laundry. Next week I was putting her in the ground. He stood up. "You ain't a replacement, if that's what you're worried about. Nobody could replace Eleanor. But this ranch has been eating bad food and worse silence for 3 years. And you fixed one of those in 4 days." He put his hat on and walked toward the house. Halfway there, he stopped. "Don't let Clarissa Bloom make you small, Abby.
That woman's been trying to shrink everyone around her since she married money. Hasn't worked yet on anyone worth a damn. Then he was gone. Abigail stood alone at the cook station, flour on her arms and something warm spreading through her chest. Not hope, not purpose. Something closer to recognition. Like being found after a long time lost and not realizing how cold you'd been until someone said your name like it mattered. She went back to kneading. The dough came out perfect. Day 7 brought trouble she didn't expect. One of the younger hands, a boy named Virgil, couldn't have been more than 19, got his hand caught in a gate hinge while loading fence posts. The iron bit through his palm, clean to the bone. The boy screamed so loud the horses spooked in the corral. Men came running. Polk grabbed the boy's wrist. Gideon shouted for someone to get clean cloth. Tommy stood frozen, staring at the blood like he'd never seen any. Abigail pushed through them. "Let me see," she said. "This ain't kitchen work, woman," Tommy snapped. "I said, let me see." She knelt beside Virgil, took his hand, and looked at the wound. Deep, ragged, bleeding heavy but not spurting, which meant no artery. "I need boiled water, clean cloth, and the whiskey from the second shelf of the chuck wagon," she said. Nobody moved. "Now," she said, and something in her voice cut through the panic like a blade. Polk went for the water. Gideon went for the cloth. Tommy went for the whiskey, because even a stubborn man follows orders when a voice carries that kind of authority. Abigail cleaned the wound while Virgil whimpered and bit down on a leather strap. She packed it with a poultice she made from herbs she kept in her supply kit, yarrow and plantain, the way her grandmother taught her, and wrapped it tight. "You'll keep this hand," she told Virgil, "but you won't use it for a week. And if you see redness spreading past the wrap, you tell me immediately." The boy nodded, tears streaking the dust on his face. "How'd you know to do that?" Polk asked, looking at her with something she hadn't seen from any of them before. Respect. Raw, unfiltered, unwilling respect. "My grandmother was a healer," Abigail said. "Back in Missouri. Folks who couldn't afford a doctor came to her. She treated everything from snake bite to broken ribs with what grew in her garden." She wiped the blood from her hands. She also weighed 240 pounds and delivered more babies than any physician in the county. Size ain't got nothing to do with capability. Polk nodded slowly. Gideon tipped his hat. Tommy said nothing. But he looked at her hands, the hands that had just saved a boy's fingers, and something cracked behind his eyes. Not enough to change him, not yet, but enough to make him quiet. And for Tommy Red, quiet was the first step toward reckoning. That night, Virgil came to the cook station after supper. His hand was bandaged, his face still pale. "Miss Callahan?" he said. "Yes?" "Thank you. For my hand." "You're welcome, Virgil." He shifted on his feet. "My mama, she's a big woman too, back in Kentucky. People talk about her the same way they talk about you." Abigail looked at the boy. 19 years old, still carrying his mother in his chest. "She sounds like good people," Abigail said. "She is. She's the best person I know." His voice cracked. "I just wanted you to know, I ain't one of them, the ones who laugh. I know, Virgil. And I'll tell the others about what you did. You don't have to do that. I know, but I'm gonna." He walked away into the dark, and Abigail pressed her hand against her chest, where the warmth was spreading again. That slow, stubborn heat that came from being seen by people who had no reason to look. Day 8 was the day everything almost broke apart. Tommy Red got drunk. Not regular drunk. Mean drunk. The kind that turns a man's insecurity into a weapon and points it at the easiest target in the room. He stumbled to the cook station after midnight, reeking of whiskey and sour sweat, and kicked over the bucket of water Abigail had set out for the morning coffee. She woke in the supply wagon to the sound of metal hitting ground and came out to find Tommy standing in the moonlight, swaying. "There she is," he said. "The queen of the kitchen." "Go to bed, Mr. Red." "You know what the boys really say about you?" He stepped closer. "They say Zeke hired you because he's lonely, because a fat woman's better than no woman when you ain't been touched in 3 years." The words hit her like a fist. "They say you're warming more than his supper." "That's a lie." "Is it? Because I see you two talking at night. I see him sitting at your fire. A man don't do that for cooking, sweetheart." Abigail's hands clenched at her sides. "You're drunk and you're cruel, and you don't know the first thing about what you're saying." "I know what I see, and what I see is a fat woman who found a meal ticket and a sad old man too broken to know the difference." "That's enough." The voice came from the dark. Zeke stepped out of the shadow of the barn. He wasn't wearing his hat. His shirt was untucked. He looked like a man who'd been pulled from sleep by the sound of something that couldn't wait until morning. Tommy straightened up. Even drunk, the boy had enough sense to feel the shift in the air. "Boss, I was just—" "I heard what you were just." Zeke walked closer. Not fast, not aggressive. The slow walk of a man who doesn't need to raise his voice because the ground shakes when he moves. "You got something to say about who I hire and why? You say it to me. At dawn. Sober." "I didn't mean—" "At dawn. Sober. Now get out of my sight." Tommy stumbled backward, almost fell, caught himself on the fence rail. Then he turned and half ran, half staggered to the bunkhouse. Silence. Abigail stood in the moonlight, arms wrapped around herself, and tried to stop shaking. Zeke looked at her. "You hurt?" "He didn't touch me." "That ain't what I asked." She swallowed hard. "I'll be fine." "Abby." She looked at him. His face was half in shadow, half in moonlight, and his eyes held something she couldn't name. Not pity, not anger. Something that lived between the two. Something that said, "I know what it costs to stand in front of someone who wants to break you, and refuse to break." "I'll be fine," she said again, quieter this time. He nodded. "Lock the wagon tonight." "I always do." He turned to leave, then stopped. What he said, about you and me, about why I hired you. "I know it ain't true." "I need you to hear me say it anyway." He faced her. "I hired you because you stood in the middle of a street and didn't flinch. I kept you because every man on this ranch eats better and works harder since you got here. Whatever else this is or isn't, it started with the work, and the work speaks for itself." He walked to the house. Abigail locked the wagon, lay down in the dark, pressed her grandmother's skillet against her chest like a shield. She didn't sleep, but she didn't cry either. Day 9, last day before the drive. Tommy Red showed up at dawn, sober, hat in his hands, eyes on the ground. Zeke was waiting by the corral. The crew watched from the bunkhouse porch, pretending not to. "You got something to say?" Zeke asked. Tommy's jaw worked. His pride was fighting this fear, and for a long moment, fear was losing. Then he looked up. "I was out of line. What I said to Miss Callahan. It was wrong." "Tell her." "I'm telling you. She's the one you owe it to." Tommy's face reddened. He looked toward the cook station, where Abigail stood, wiping down the work table, pretending she couldn't hear every word. He walked over, slow, like each step cost him something. "Miss Callahan?" She stopped wiping. "Mr. Red?" "I said things last night that weren't right. I was drunk, and I was stupid, and I'm sorry." She looked at him, really looked, past the sunburn and the freckles and the bravado. She saw a boy, 22 years old, scared of everything he couldn't control, scared of a woman who didn't need his approval, scared of a world that was bigger than the size of his certainty.
"Apology accepted," she said. "Just like that?"
Just like that. But Mr. Red, if you come to my cook station drunk again, I won't wait for Mr. Turner to handle it. I'll handle it myself. And I promise you, my cast iron skillet is heavier than your opinion." Polk burst out laughing from the porch. Even Gideon cracked a smile. Tommy stared at her for a second. Then something happened that Abigail didn't expect. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smirk, not the cruel grin she'd seen before. Something smaller, realer. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He put his hat on and walked to the corral. Abigail went back to wiping the table. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. That afternoon, the ranch was a storm of preparation. Saddles oiled, ropes coiled, horses checked and reshod. The chuck wagon packed and repacked 3 times because Abigail refused to leave without her full supply kit. Zeke rode the perimeter and came back dusty and grim. The heat wave was building. Water would be the problem. Always was in July on the open range, but this year felt different. The air sat heavy on the land like a hand pressing down on a chest, and every man on the ranch could feel it. Abigail packed the wagon by lantern light. She counted her supplies twice. Flour, lard, coffee, salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, sugar, canned tomatoes, the yarrow and plantain for wounds, a bottle of whiskey for emergencies, her grandmother's skillet, wrapped in cloth and placed where she could reach it in the dark. She closed the wagon and sat on the driver's bench, looking out of the ranch in the last light of the day. 12 men, 6 weeks, open prairie, relentless sun, and her. The fat woman from Missouri who sold pies on the street. The woman Clarissa Bloom called Charity. The woman Tommy Red called a meal ticket. The woman Zeke Turner called by her name. She gripped the reins and whispered to the empty air, "All right, Grandma. Let's see what we're made of." The cattle drive started at first light, and Abigail May Callahan rode out with it. 3 weeks on the trail, and the heat had turned mean. Not summer heat. Not the kind that made men sweat and complain and dunk their heads in the creek. This was something else. This was the kind of heat that sat on a man's chest at night and whispered that water was a memory and shade was a lie. The cattle moved slower each day. The men talked less. Coffee ran low on the 14th day, and Abigail stretched what she had with roasted chicory root until the men couldn't tell the difference. She didn't tell them. Didn't need to. Her job was to keep them fed and standing, and she'd figured out early on that the secret to feeding men who were breaking down was to never let them see you worry about the supplies. But she was worried. She counted the flour that morning and did the math twice. At the current rate, she had enough for 12 days. The drive had 18 left. She closed the barrel and said nothing. Polk rode up to the chuck wagon at midday and pulled his horse alongside her bench. He'd lost weight. They all had. 3 weeks of heat and dust stripped a man down to bone and habit. "Miss Callahan," he said, "the boys are talking about water." "What about it?" "Creek we were supposed to hit today is dry." Gideon rode ahead and confirmed it. Nothing but cracked mud for a quarter mile. Abigail's hands tightened on the reins. "What does Mr. Turner say?" "Says we push north. Thinks there's a spring-fed pool about 2 days' ride. But the cattle won't make 2 days without water. Not in this heat." "Then we better find it in 1. Polk looked at her. "You ain't scared?" "I'm terrified, Mr. Polk. But terrified and useless ain't the same thing." He almost smiled. Almost. Then he tipped his hat and rode back to the herd. That night, Abigail rationed the water for the first time. Half portions for the men, quarter portions for cooking. She made a thin bean soup and stretched it with salt and wild onion she'd pulled from a ditch that morning. Tommy Red looked into his bowl and said, "This is it?" "This is it," Abigail said. "I've had more in a teacup." "Then pretend you're drinking tea, Mr. Red." He looked at her. She braced for the fight. But Tommy just shook his head, picked up his spoon, and ate without another word. Something had changed in him since the night Zeke dressed him down. Not a transformation. Men don't transform in 3 weeks. But a crack. A fracture in the wall he'd built between who he was and who he could be. Abigail could see it. She'd seen it in herself enough times to recognize the architecture of a person mid-collapse. Zeke rode in late. Dust covered him head to boot. His horse looked half dead. He dismounted slowly, the way a man does when his body is arguing with his will, and walked to the cook station. "How much water we got?" he asked. "Enough for tomorrow. Maybe the morning after if I cut the coffee." "Cut the coffee. The men won't like it. The men will like dying of thirst less." He sat down on the bench and pulled his hat off. Abigail had never seen him without his hat this close. His hair was gray at the temples. There was a scar above his left ear she hadn't noticed before. He looked older in the firelight, older and heavier, like the weight of 12 men and 600 cattle had settled into his shoulders and made a home there. "The spring is there," he said. "I can feel it. But I need another day." "Then you've got another day." He looked at her. "You ever think about quitting? Every day. Why don't you?" She ladled the last of the soup into a bowl and set it in front of him. "Because quitting means going back to selling pies in front of saloons and listening to cowboys laugh at my body. And I've decided I'd rather die of thirst in the middle of nowhere than go back to being someone's joke." Zeke picked up the spoon, ate slowly. When the bowl was empty, he set it down and said, "You ain't nobody's joke, Abby." "Not out here." "Not out here," she agreed. "But out here ain't forever." He stood up, put his hat back on. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be hard." "Harder than today?" "Harder than anything." He was right. The next morning, Abigail woke to the sound of a cow screaming. Not mooing, screaming. The raw, broken sound of an animal pushed past its limit. She threw open the wagon canvas and saw the herd in chaos. Cattle stumbling, falling, 2 already down in the dust and not getting up. Gideon rode past at full gallop, shouting, "We're losing them! The heat's killing them where they stand!" Zeke was already mounted, riding the edge of the herd, trying to keep the rest from scattering. Tommy and Virgil worked the far flank, pushing strays back toward the center. Abigail jumped down from the wagon. "How many down?" "4 so far," Polk said, riding up fast. "Could be more by noon." "Where's the spring?" "North, maybe 6 hours." "These animals don't have 6 hours." Polk looked at her. "What do you want me to do?" And that was the moment Abigail realized something had shifted without anyone naming it. Polk, a man who'd ridden cattle trails for 20 years, was asking her. Not Zeke, who was too far out with the herd. Not Tommy. Not Gideon. Her. "The water barrel's in the chuck wagon," she said. "We've got 4. That's cooking water, drinking water, everything we have left. You can't give the cattle our water." "I can give them enough to get on their feet. Just enough. Wet their mouths. Get them moving. If we lose the herd, Mr. Polk, we lose everything, including us." He stared at her for a hard 3 seconds. Then he said, "Tell me what to do." "Pull the barrels. Get every man with a bucket. Small amounts, just enough to wet their muzzles and get them standing. Don't waste a drop. I'll figure out the rest." Polk rode off, shouting orders. Abigail grabbed 2 buckets from the wagon and started running. Running. 230 pounds of her, sprinting across cracked earth in the brutal morning heat, carrying water to dying cattle, because no one else was close enough. She reached the first downed cow and poured water over its muzzle. The animal's eyes were glazed. She slapped its flank. "Get up! Come on, you stubborn thing! Get up!" The cow blinked, licked the water from its lips. Then, slow as sunrise, it staggered to its feet. Abigail moved to the next one, and the next, and the next. Virgil appeared beside her, carrying a bucket with his bandaged hand, his face white with pain. "You shouldn't be lifting with that hand," she said. "And you shouldn't be running in this heat," he said. "Reckon we're both stupid." She almost laughed. Almost. They worked side by side for an hour, bucket by bucket, cow by cow. The sun climbed higher, and the heat pressed down, and Abigail's legs burned, and her lungs ached, and the sweat poured off her body in sheets. And she did not stop. She did not stop. Zeke saw her from across the herd. He'd been fighting a cluster of panicked steers near the front, trying to keep them from bolting into open desert. He got them turned, got them moving, and then he looked back and saw Abigail, this big, heavy, sweat-soaked woman, running between fallen cattle with a bucket in each hand, bringing them back to life, one muzzle at a time. He pulled his horse up and watched, and something in his chest that had been locked for 3 years turned like a key. By midday, they'd lost 6 head. Could have been 30. Would have been if Abigail hadn't given the order to use the drinking water. The men knew it, every single one of them. Nobody said it out loud, but when they gathered at the chuck wagon for a rest, no food, no coffee, just shade and silence. Nobody looked at Abigail the way they used to. Not with pity, not with mockery, not even with curiosity. With something else. Tommy Red sat down on the ground near the wagon wheel and said, to no one in particular, "That woman ran faster than half of us today." Nobody argued. Zeke found the spring 4 hours later. He rode back at a gallop, hat gone, shirt torn, and shouted, "Water! 2 miles north! Move!" The herd smelled it before they saw it. Cattle that had been stumbling suddenly surged forward. The men rode hard to keep them from stampeding. It was controlled chaos, hooves and dust and shouting, and the raw, desperate energy of animals and men who'd been dying by inches for 2 days. Abigail drove the chuck wagon at a pace that rattled every pot and pan she owned. She hit a rut and nearly went over, caught the bench with both hands, held on, kept driving. When they reached the spring, the cattle plunged in and drank like the world was ending. The men dismounted and fell to their knees at the edge and drank with their hands and poured water over their heads and didn't care who saw. Abigail climbed down from the wagon, walked to the water's edge, knelt in the mud, and drank. The water was cold, clean, alive. She drank until her stomach hurt, and then she sat back in the mud and pressed her wet hands to her face and breathed. Zeke walked over. He was limping. She hadn't noticed before. His left leg dragged slightly, and there was blood on his boot. "You're hurt," she said. "Horse stepped on my foot this morning. It's nothing." "Let me see." "It's nothing, Abby." "Ezekiel Turner, sit down and let me see your foot, or I swear I will knock you down and look at it anyway." Polk, who was standing within earshot, choked on his water. Zeke stared at her. Then he sat down. She pulled off his boot. He winced, hard, the kind of wince a man only shows when he can't help it, and found his foot swollen and purple across the top. Not broken, she thought, but close. "You've been riding on this all day?" she said. "Had to." "You're an idiot." "Probably." She wrapped it with the last of her clean cloth, tight enough to keep the swelling down, gentle enough that he could still stand. "You need to stay off this for 2 days," she said. "Can't. Drive doesn't stop." "Then ride in the wagon with me tomorrow, and let Gideon lead the herd." Zeke opened his mouth to argue. Then he looked at her face, really looked, and saw something that stopped the words in his throat. Not pity, not softness.
Something fiercer. Something that said, I am not asking you. I am telling you. Because someone has to care whether you survive this. And right now that someone is me. 1 day, he said. 2. 1.5. Done. He almost smiled. Not quite. But the muscles around his eyes shifted the way they do when a man who's forgotten how to smile remembers the shape of it. That night, Abigail cooked with spring water and fresh energy and a kind of desperate gratitude that turned ordinary beans and salt pork into something that tasted like salvation. The men ate in silence. The good silence. The silence of people who've been through something together and don't need to explain it. After supper, Gideon came to the cook station and set down his plate. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Mr. Gideon, what you did today, with the water, the cattle." He paused, pulled at his beard. "My wife, she would have done the same. Exactly the same." Abigail felt the tears push against the back of her eyes. She held them like she'd held everything else for 3 years, with force and practice and the stubborn refusal to let the world see her soft. "That's the kindest thing anyone said to me in a very long time," she whispered. Gideon nodded. Meant every word. He picked up his hat. "Good night, Miss Callahan." "Good night, Mr. Gideon." He walked away into the dark. Abigail pressed her hand to her mouth and breathed. In and out. In and out. Until the tears retreated and the strength came back and she was herself again. Then she heard the shout. "Fire!" Tommy's voice, raw, panicked, coming from the east ridge. Abigail spun around and saw it, orange light crawling across the dry grass like a living thing, moving fast, pushed by a wind that had come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Men scrambled, horses screamed, cattle bellowed and surged against each other in blind terror. Zeke was on his feet before Abigail could stop him, bad foot and all, shouting orders. "Move the herd west! Get them to the water! Poke, take the left flank! Tommy, right! Go! Go!" The men mounted and rode into the chaos, but the fire was faster. It jumped the dry ridge and raced toward the camp. Sparks flew ahead of the main line, catching grass and brush, and turning the night into a furnace. Abigail stood at the chuck wagon and watched the wall of orange light closing in, and felt fear. Real fear. The kind that reaches into your chest and squeezes. For the first time since she'd arrived in Silver Creek. Then she stopped feeling it. Because there was no time. "Virgil!" she shouted. The boy was standing frozen near the supply wagon, his bandaged hand pressed against his chest, his eyes wide with the blank terror of someone watching their own death walk toward them. "Virgil, look at me!" He looked. "Get every blanket from the wagon. Soap them in the spring. Now!" He ran. Abigail grabbed the cooking canvas, a heavy waxed cloth she used to cover the fire pit in rain, and dragged it toward the approaching flames. She beat the ground ahead of the fire line, smothering sparks before they could catch, stamping the earth with her boots, swinging the canvas like a weapon. Her arms burned, her lungs filled with smoke, her eyes watered until she could barely see. She did not stop. Virgil came back with soaked blankets, and she grabbed one and beat it against the ground alongside him. 2 other hands who'd stayed behind, an older man named Crawford and a quiet Mexican vaquero named Tomas, saw what she was doing and joined in. 4 people against a prairie fire. 4 people and a fat woman who refused to die. The fire line hit the wet ground near the spring and slowed. The soaked blankets smothered the front edge. Abigail directed Tomas to the left flank, where sparks were jumping toward the chuck wagon. "Don't let it reach the supplies," she shouted. "Everything we have is in that wagon." Tomas ran. Crawford followed. Abigail kept beating the fire line. Her canvas caught a spark, and the edge ignited. She ripped the burning piece off with her bare hand and threw it into the dirt and kept going.
Then she heard the scream. Not a cow, not a horse, a man. She turned and saw Crawford on the ground, his leg twisted under him, smoke pouring over his body. He'd tripped on a root and gone down hard, and the fire was 5 feet away and closing. Abigail ran. She crossed 20 feet of burning ground in seconds. She felt the heat through her boots, felt it on her face and her arms and her chest. She reached Crawford and grabbed him under both arms and pulled. 230 pounds of woman, dragging 170 pounds of man, across scorched earth, through smoke so thick she couldn't see her own hands. She pulled him 10 feet, 20, 30. Her back screamed, her legs shook, her lungs begged for clean air that didn't exist. She pulled him to the edge of the spring and collapsed. Crawford was coughing, alive. His leg might be broken, but he was alive. Virgil appeared through the smoke and poured water over both of them, and Abigail lay on her back in the mud and breathed. The fire burned itself out at the spring's edge. The wet ground stopped it cold. The wind shifted south and carried the flames away from the camp and out into open prairie where there was nothing left to burn. It was over. Abigail lay in the mud, chest heaving, hands blistered, face black with soot, and stared up at a sky full of stars she could barely see through the smoke. She was alive. Crawford was alive. The supplies were safe. The camp was standing. Zeke rode in 20 minutes later. The herd was scattered but alive, pushed to the far side of the spring by Polk and Tommy and Gideon. He dismounted, fell, more like, his bad foot giving out, and limped to the camp and stopped. He saw the scorched earth, the soaked blankets, the smothered fire line. Crawford sitting by the spring with his legs splinted. Virgil had done that, using the technique he'd watched Abigail use on his own hand. He saw Abigail sitting in the mud, covered in soot and burns, her apron torn, her hair wild, her eyes red from smoke. He stood there and looked at her, and didn't speak for a long time. Tommy rode in behind him. He dismounted and walked to the fire line and saw the canvas, burned, shredded, and the boot prints in the scorched earth. He followed them. He saw where Abigail had stood and fought. He saw where she'd run to Crawford. He saw the drag marks. He turned and looked at her. "You did this," he said, not a question. "I had help," Abigail said. "Virgil, Crawford, Tomas. But you did this." She didn't answer. She was too tired to argue about credit. Tommy took off his hat, held it against his chest, and said, quiet enough that only the people nearby could hear, "I was wrong about you, Miss Callahan. I was wrong about everything." Abigail looked at him. This boy, this loud, scared, stubborn boy who'd called her a meal ticket and kicked over her water bucket and laughed at her body since the day she arrived. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." "I know that too." Tommy put his hat back on and walked away. His shoulders were shaking. He might have been crying. Hard to tell in the dark. Zeke limped over and lowered himself to the ground beside her. He sat in the mud and didn't care. His bad foot stretched out in front of him. His hands hung between his knees. "You saved Crawford's life," he said. "I did what needed doing. You held this camp together. Somebody had to." He turned his head and looked at her, covered in mud and soot and burn marks, sitting in the wreckage of a night that should have killed them all. And he said something she never expected. "Eleanor would have liked you." Abigail's breath caught. "She would have liked you very much," he said. "And she would have told me I was a fool for not saying so sooner." He reached over and took her hand, her burned, blistered, mud-caked hand, and he held it. Not tight, not possessive, not like a man claiming something, like a man recognizing something. Something he thought he buried with his wife 3 years ago. Something he thought was gone forever. Abigail didn't pull away. She sat in the mud beside Ezekiel Turner and held his hand and watched the last embers of the fire die out across the prairie. And for the first time in 3 years, she let one tear fall. Just one. It cut a clean line through the soot on her cheek, and she didn't wipe it away. The drive came home on a Tuesday. 6 weeks, 12 men, 594 head of cattle out of 600. 6 lost to the heat. Not one lost to the fire. Silver Creek saw them coming from a mile out. Dust cloud rising above the ridge. The low rumble of hooves. The sharp whistle of men pushing the last stretch. Rolts gathered on the main street the way they always did when a drive came in. Shopkeepers stepping onto porches. Children climbing fences. Women shading their eyes with one hand and holding their opinions with the other. Abigail drove the chuck wagon through the center of town. She sat straight on the bench, reins in blistered hands, apron filthy, hair pulled back with a strip of leather because she'd lost her last pin somewhere on the trail. She was sunburned and thinner. Not thin, never thin, but the trail had carved something away and left something harder underneath. She didn't look left. She didn't look right. She looked straight ahead. But she felt them watching. Every eye on the street. She felt the weight of Silver Creek's judgment pressing down on her like it had the first day she'd walked into town holding a pie tin. Only this time, she'd come back with something a pie tin couldn't carry. The crew dismounted at the stockyard. Men unloaded. Cattle were counted and sorted and penned. It was loud, chaotic work, the kind that doesn't allow for ceremony. Abigail pulled the chuck wagon to the side of the road and started unpacking. She had a system. She always had a system. Pots here, supplies there. Grandmother's skillet wrapped and tucked safe. She was elbow deep in the wagon when she heard the voice. "Well, you survived." Clarissa Bloom stood 10 feet away, parasol in hand, smile fixed in place like something painted on a china plate. Harold Bloom stood behind her, a round, quiet man who wore his wife's ambition like a suit he couldn't take off. "Mrs. Bloom," Abigail said, "you look weathered." "I feel weathered." "I'm sure." Clarissa tilted her head. "We heard about the fire. Terrible business. People are saying it nearly destroyed the whole herd." "People are saying a lot of things, I imagine." "They are." Clarissa stepped closer. Her voice dropped to that sweet, confidential tone that Abigail had learned to recognize as the sound of a knife being sharpened. "Some people are saying you nearly got men killed out there, that you gave the drinking water to cattle and left the crew with nothing, that the fire started near your cook station." Abigail's hands stopped moving. "That's a lie," she said. "Is it? I'm just telling you what I've heard, dear, from concerned citizens." "Which citizens?" Clarissa waved her hand. "Does it matter? The point is, people talk. And when a woman of your situation inserts herself into a man's world, people notice when things go wrong." Abigail climbed down from the wagon. Slowly. She stood in front of Clarissa Bloom and looked her in the eye. And for the first time, she noticed something she'd missed before. Behind the silk dress and the pearl earrings and the practiced smile, Clarissa Bloom was afraid. Not of Abigail, of something bigger. Of a world where a woman's worth wasn't measured by who she married, or what she wore, or how small she could make herself. A world where a fat woman from Missouri could ride out on a cattle drive and come back standing. That terrified Clarissa Bloom, because if Abigail could do that, then what was Clarissa's silk dress worth? "Mrs. Bloom," Abigail said, "I'm too tired to fight you, and I reckon you're too smart to believe your own lies. So let's just leave it here." She turned back to the wagon. Clarissa's voice followed her. "I'm only trying to help, Miss Callahan. Someone needs to protect Mr. Turner's reputation. His reputation doesn't need your protection, and neither does mine." Clarissa opened her mouth to say something else, but a voice cut through from across the street. "Clarissa!" Zeke stood by the stockyard gate, hat in hand, dust covering every inch of him. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. But the single word carried the weight of a man who had stopped pretending politeness meant the same thing as patience.
"Ezekiel," Clarissa said, recovering her smile, "welcome home. I was just telling Miss Callahan how worried the town was about—"
"I heard what you were telling her." Clarissa's smile thinned. "The fire didn't start at the cook station," Zeke said. "Lightning hit the dry ridge. Miss Callahan organized the defense that saved the camp, the supplies, and Crawford's life. Every man on my crew will tell you the same."
"I wasn't suggesting—"
"Yes, you were." He stepped forward. "And I want you to stop. I want you to stop visiting my ranch with preserves and opinions. I want you to stop spreading stories about a woman who did more in 6 weeks than this town has done for her in 6 months. And I want you to tell whatever concerned citizens you've been talking to that if they have questions about my drive, they can ask me. Directly." Clarissa's face went white, then red, then settled into a mask of wounded dignity that she'd clearly practiced in front of a mirror.
"I see," she said. "I see exactly what's happened here."
"No, ma'am," Zeke said. "I don't think you do." He turned and walked away. Clarissa stood on the street for a long moment, parasol trembling in her hand. Harold Bloom touched her elbow and whispered something. She shook him off, turned, and walked in the opposite direction. Abigail watched her go and felt nothing. Not victory, not relief. Just the hollow exhaustion of a woman who'd been fighting so long she'd forgotten what peace felt like. That evening, Zeke sent word through the crew. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, outside the general store. He wanted the whole town there. Polk told Abigail while she was washing the last of the trail pots. "He's calling a gathering," Polk said. "Public." "What for?" "Didn't say, but I reckon you can guess." Abigail set down the pot.
"I didn't ask him to do this."
"I know.
I don't need a public defense, Mr. Polk. I just need people to leave me be."
Polk sat down on the bench and took off his hat. His hair was thin and gray and matted with dust. He looked 10 years older than when the drive started. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I've been riding cattle for 22 years. I've seen good men and bad men and plenty in between. I've seen courage on the trail, and I've seen cowardice. And I'm telling you right now, what you did out there, with the water, with the fire, with Crawford, that ain't the kind of thing that should be whispered about in the back of Clarissa Bloom's parlor. That's the kind of thing that should be said out loud, in front of everyone." Abigail looked at him. This quiet, steady man, who'd barely spoken 20 words to her the first 2 weeks of the drive. "Why does it matter?" she asked. "Whether they know or not?" "I know what I did. The crew knows." "Because respect only counts if it's public, Miss Callahan. Private respect is just guilt with manners." She didn't have an answer for that. Polk put his hat on and stood up. 10 o'clock. Be there." He walked away. Abigail sat alone with the clean pots and the dying fire and a knot in her stomach that wouldn't untie. She didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, because of something worse. Hope. The terrible, dangerous, unreliable hope that maybe, tomorrow would be different from every other day she'd lived in every other town. She'd been wrong before. Morning came too fast. Abigail dressed in her cleanest clothes, a brown cotton dress that had been washed so many times the color was closer to dust than fabric, and her grandmother's apron, which she wore not because she needed it, but because wearing it felt like holding a hand. She walked to the general store at 10 minutes past 10, because arriving on time felt too much like wanting something. And Abigail had trained herself a long time ago to never look like she wanted anything. The crowd was bigger than she expected. Half the town, it seemed. Shopkeepers, ranchers, their wives, farmhands, the barber, the blacksmith. Children sat on the rail of the feed store porch. Dogs lay in the shade. The preacher from the church on Oak Street stood at the back with his arms crossed and his Bible under his arm. Clarissa Bloom was there, center of the crowd. Silk dress, pearl earrings, armor. Zeke stood on the porch of the general store, hat in hand. The crew flanked him. Polk, Gideon, Tommy, Virgil, Crawford on crutches with his leg splinted, Tomas, and the rest. 12 men standing behind their boss like a wall. Abigail stopped at the edge of the crowd. She didn't push forward. She didn't need to be close. She'd spent her whole life at the edge of rooms and crowds and gatherings, and the edge was where she knew the exits. Zeke waited until the murmuring stopped. Then he spoke. "Most of you know me," he said. "You knew my wife. You know my ranch. You know I don't talk unless I have something to say." Silence. The crowd leaned in, the way people do when they can feel something coming. 6 weeks ago, I hired Abigail Callahan to cook for my cattle drive. Some of you had opinions about that. Some of you shared those opinions loudly. Some of you shared them quietly, which is worse. He looked at Clarissa. She held his gaze. Barely. "I want to tell you what happened on that drive. Not what you heard, not what was whispered over your supper tables. What happened?" He told them. He told them about the heat, about the dry creek, about the cattle dropping in the dust, and Abigail giving the order to use the last of the drinking water, their water, the crew's water, to save the herd. He told them how she ran in that heat, bucket in each hand, 230 pounds, crossing scorched earth faster than men half her size. He told them about the fire, how it jumped the ridge and came for the camp, how Abigail grabbed the cooking canvas and fought the fire line while 4 men followed her lead, how she ran into burning ground to drag Crawford to safety. He looked at Crawford. Crawford nodded. "She carried me," Crawford said, and his voice broke on the word. "Dragged me 30 feet through fire. I weigh 170 pounds, and she didn't stop. She didn't even slow down." Silence. Zeke continued. "I've heard what some of you have said about Miss Callahan since she arrived in Silver Creek. I've heard the words you use. I've heard the jokes. I've heard the concern." He looked at Clarissa again. The very sincere concern. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not laughter. Something more uncomfortable than that. "I want to be clear about something," Zeke said. "This woman was mocked for her size every day she lived in this town. She was mocked on my ranch by my own men. She was called names I won't repeat in mixed company. And when fire came, when real danger came, she didn't run from it. She ran toward it." He paused, let the silence build. "How many of you would have done the same?" Nobody answered. "How many of you even asked her name before you decided what she was worth?" Silence. "Her name is Abigail May Callahan. She's from Missouri. Her grandmother taught her to heal wounds and cook food that could make a grown man cry. She carried every insult this town threw at her, and she didn't throw a single one back. And when my ranch was burning, she held it together with her bare hands." He put his hat on. "If you disrespect her, you disrespect this ranch. You disrespect every man standing behind me, and you disrespect me." He stepped off the porch. The crowd didn't move. Then Tommy Red stepped forward. Every head turned. Tommy was the last person anyone expected to speak. He was the town's own, born in Silver Creek, raised on ranches, the kind of young man who said what everyone else was thinking but wouldn't say out loud. He took off his hat. "I owe Miss Callahan more apologies than I can count,"
he said. His voice was rough, unsteady. The voice of a man speaking against the current of his own pride. I said things to her that I wouldn't say to a dog. I judged her by what she looked like, and I was wrong. Dead wrong. He looked at Abigail across the crowd. His eyes were red. You're the toughest person I ever rode with, Miss Callahan, man or woman. And I'm ashamed it took a fire for me to see it. He put his hat back on and stepped back. Virgil spoke next. He didn't step forward. He just said, from where he stood, holding up his bandaged hand, "She saved my hand on day 7. Cleaned it and wrapped it and told me I'd keep my fingers. Doctor in town said the same thing when I got back. Said whoever treated it knew exactly what they were doing." Gideon stepped forward, the oldest man on the crew, the quietest. He stood in front of the crowd and said 3 words. "She's the real thing." Then he stepped back. Silence. Abigail stood at the edge of the crowd with her hands pressed flat against her grandmother's apron, and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She didn't know what to do. She'd imagined this moment. Not this specific moment, but a moment like it. A moment where the world looked at her and saw something other than her body. She'd imagined it in every town, in every church, in front of every mirror and every store window that reflected her back at herself, in all her width and weight and wonder. She'd imagined what she'd say. But now that it was here, she didn't have a speech. She didn't have words. She had a truth, and it was small and quiet, and it was the only thing she'd ever really wanted. She walked forward. The crowd parted, not like she was Moses and they were the Red Sea, more like they were stepping aside because they suddenly realized they'd been standing in someone's way for a very long time. She stopped in front of the porch. Zeke stood to her right. The crew stood behind her. The town stood before her. She looked at Clarissa Bloom, at Mr. Dawson, the shopkeeper, at Mrs. Pearson from the boarding house, at the preacher with his Bible, at every face that had stared and whispered and judged and dismissed. "I didn't come to Silver Creek to prove anything," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't performing. She was talking to people the way you talk to people when you've stopped caring whether they listen. "I came because I was broke and I was hungry and I needed work. That's all." She paused. "You looked at me and saw a fat woman. That's fine. I'm a fat woman. I've been a fat woman every day of my life. And I'll be one tomorrow, and the day after that. It ain't a secret, and it ain't a shame." She looked down at her hands, the blisters, the burn scars, the flour-stained fingers that had fed 12 men for 6 weeks, and dragged a man out of a fire, and held Ezekiel Turner's hand in the mud. "I never needed your admiration," she said. "I never asked for your pity. I never wanted your charity." She looked up. "I just wanted fairness. That's all. Just fairness." She stopped talking, not because she'd run out of words, because she'd said the only ones that mattered. The silence lasted 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then Mrs. Pearson, thin, sharp-nosed Mrs. Pearson from the boarding house, who'd complained about the smell of pies and told Abigail to keep to herself, stepped forward. "Miss Callahan," she said, and her voice was small in a way Abigail had never heard it before. "I have a room, if you need one. No charge, for as long as you need." Abigail looked at her. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Pearson." Mr. Dawson, the shopkeeper, cleared his throat. I'd like to carry your pies in the store, if you're still baking. I could give you a fair price, better than 30 cents. "I'm still baking," Abigail said. A woman Abigail didn't know, middle-aged, calloused hands, a farmer's wife, stepped forward and said, "My daughter's getting married in September. Could you do the cake?" "I could do the cake." "And the supper?" "I could do the supper too."
One by one, they came. Not a flood, not a wave of sudden redemption. Just people. Ordinary people who'd been wrong and knew it, and were trying, in their clumsy, insufficient way, to say so. Not all of them. Clarissa Bloom didn't move. She stood rigid in the center of the crowd, watching her world rearrange itself around a woman she'd tried to destroy. And her face held the frozen expression of someone who'd just realized that the weapon she'd spent years sharpening didn't work anymore. Harold Bloom touched her elbow. She shook him off. Again. She turned and walked away. No speech, no concession. Just the sharp click of heels on packed dirt and the swish of a silk dress disappearing around the corner of the Mercantile. Abigail watched her go. She didn't feel victory. She felt something sadder. She felt the recognition that Clarissa Bloom was a woman trapped inside a cage she'd built herself and called it a castle. And tearing down other women was the only way she knew to make the walls feel less like prison. Abigail almost pitied her. Almost. The crowd thinned. People went back to their business. The day resumed. The sun moved. The dust settled. Zeke walked Abigail down the main street. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. They walked side by side, like two people who'd earned the right to occupy the same space without explanation. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did." "Why?" He stopped walking, turned to face her. "Because Eleanor would have." Abigail looked at him, this tall, grief-worn man who'd built walls around his heart so thick that not even 3 years of silence could crack them. And yet here he stood, in the middle of Silver Creek, having torn those walls down in front of the whole town. Not for himself, for her. "Your wife sounds like she was remarkable," Abigail said. "She was, and she would have told me I waited too long to speak up." He looked down the street. She would have been right. They stood there, in the middle of the road, in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of a town that was slowly, imperfectly, painfully learning to see a woman it had refused to look at. "What happens now?" Abigail asked. "Now?" Zeke put his hat on. "Now I need a cook. Permanent. Not trail work. The ranch. Year-round." "Year-round?" "If you want it." She looked at him. "I want it." He nodded. "Then it's yours." He turned and walked toward the stockyard. Abigail stood in the street and pressed her hands against her grandmother's apron and felt the fabric, worn thin, flour-stained, smelling of smoke and salt and 6 weeks of trail dust, and held on to it the way she held on to everything that mattered. Gently, but with all her strength. Polk found her there 5 minutes later. "Miss Callahan," he said, tipping his hat. "The boys want to know what's for supper." She laughed. The first real laugh in weeks. It came from somewhere deep and surprised her with its sound. Full and warm and bigger than she expected. Like it had been stored inside her for years, waiting for a reason. "Tell the boys," she said. "I'm making biscuits." Polk grinned, the first grin she'd ever seen on his face. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He walked away whistling. Abigail May Callahan rolled up her sleeves, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked toward Zeke Turner's ranch. Not as charity, not as gossip, not as the fat woman from Missouri who sold pies on the street. As the cook, as the healer, as the woman who ran into fire, as someone who belonged. The biscuits that night were the best she'd ever made. She didn't know why. Same flour, same lard, same cast-iron skillet her grandmother had carried from Tennessee to Missouri in a wagon with a broken axle. Same hands, same fire. But something had shifted. Something in the way she measured and mixed and kneaded. Like the dough knew she wasn't afraid anymore, and it responded the way living things do, when the hands holding them finally stopped shaking. The crew ate in silence. The good silence. The kind that settles over men who've been through something together and come out the other side, speaking a language that doesn't need words. Crawford sat with his broken leg propped on a feed sack and ate 3 biscuits before anyone else finished one. Virgil sat beside him, cutting his meat with his good hand, his bandaged hand resting on his knee like a badge he'd earned. Tommy Red ate at the end of the table, quiet, head down. He'd been quiet since the gathering outside the general store. Not the hostile quiet of a man biting his tongue, the still quiet of a man listening to his own thoughts for the first time and not liking what he heard. After supper, he brought his plate to the wash station and set it down. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Mr. Red? I want to say something, and I don't know how to say it right, so I'm just going to say it wrong and hope you understand." She stopped washing, looked at him. "Go ahead." "My mama raised me better than how I acted. She raised me to judge a person by their work and their word, and I forgot that. I forgot it the minute I saw you because it was easier to laugh than to look." His voice cracked on the last word. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I don't know how to fix what I said. I don't know if sorry is enough. But I want you to know, the next time somebody laughs at a woman like you, I won't be laughing with them. I'll be the one telling them to shut their mouth." Abigail looked at this boy, 22 years old, red hair, freckles, the same face that had called her a kitchen queen and a meal ticket, and worse. And behind that face, something new, something raw and unfinished and trying. "That's enough, Tommy," she said, and she meant it. He nodded, picked up his hat, walked away, then stopped, turned back. "One more thing." "What?" "Your biscuits are better than my mama's, and if you ever tell her I said that, I'll deny it to my grave." She laughed. He grinned. A real grin, the first she'd ever seen from him that wasn't built on someone else's pain, and walked into the dark. Abigail finished the dishes alone. She always did. But tonight the loneliness of it felt different. Less like exile and more like choice. The chosen quiet of a woman who'd earned her space and didn't need company to fill it. Zeke found her afterward. He came to the cook station the way he always did, boots heavy on the packed dirt, hat in hand, moving like a man who carried his own weather. He sat on the bench across from her and said nothing for a long time. Abigail dried her hands and sat down. "You're thinking loud tonight," she said. "I'm thinking about Eleanor." She went still, not afraid, just careful. The way you're careful with a door you've been invited to open but don't know what's behind. "What about her?" Abigail asked. Zeke turned his hat in his hands, round and round, the way he did when words were fighting their way out of a place that had been locked for years. "The last thing she said to me," he said, "the morning before the fever took her. She grabbed my hand and said, 'Don't you dare close up, Ezekiel Turner. Don't you dare let grief make you small.'" His voice didn't break, but it bent, like a beam bearing too much weight. "And I did exactly what she told me not to do," he said. "I closed up. I shut every door. I stopped eating at the table because the empty chair across from me was louder than any sound I'd ever heard. I stopped going to church because people kept telling me she was in a better place, and I wanted to hit every one of them." Abigail didn't speak. She just listened. Because some words need space the way a fire needs air, and interrupting would have been the same as smothering. 3 years, Zeke said. 3 years I lived like a man in a coffin who forgot to lie down. And then you showed up with a pie tin and told a cowboy to go to hell without raising your voice. And something broke open. He looked at her. "I ain't saying this right." "You're saying it fine." I ain't trying to replace Eleanor.
I know. And I ain't trying to save you. You don't need saving. That's the whole damn point. You don't need saving, and I don't need saving. And maybe that's why. He stopped, swallowed, started again. Maybe that's why it works. Because we're not two broken people trying to fix each other. We're two broken people sitting at the same fire and not pretending we're whole. Abigail felt the words land in her chest like stones dropped into still water. Ripple after ripple after ripple. Zeke, she said, and it was the first time she'd called him by his name, without the mister, and the sound of it changed the air between them. Yeah? I need to tell you something. All right. She folded her hands in her lap, pressed them together. The way she did when she was holding herself in place. I've been rejected by every town I've ever lived in. Every one. Abilene, Dodge City, Wichita, Lawrence. I've been run out of boarding houses and turned away from churches and laughed out of general stores. A preacher once told me my body was God's punishment for sin. A doctor once told me I'd die before 30 if I didn't starve myself thin. A man I thought loved me once told me he'd marry me if I lost 100 pounds. And when I said I wouldn't, he said I'd die alone and deserve it. Her voice was steady, rock steady. The steadiness of a woman who'd told this story to herself so many times it had worn smooth like a river stone. I came to Silver Creek with $4.12 and a pie recipe, and nothing else. No family, no friends, no plan beyond tomorrow. And when you hired me, I told myself not to hope. I told myself this was just another town, and you were just another man. And the minute things got hard, you'd look at me the way everyone else does and decide I wasn't worth the trouble. She looked at him. But you didn't. You looked at me the same way from the first day to the last. Like I was a person, not a body, not a problem. A person. And I don't know what to do with that, because nobody's ever... She stopped. Her voice caught. The rock-steady voice that had held through 6 weeks of trail and fire and mockery caught on the edge of something it couldn't smooth over. Nobody's ever just let me be what I am, she whispered. Zeke set his hat on the table. He reached across and took her hands, both of them. Held them the way you hold something you've been looking for and didn't know you'd lost. Abby, he said, you are what you are. And what you are is the bravest person I've ever known, including Eleanor. And she'd crack me across the jaw for saying that, but it's the truth. Abigail laughed, a wet, broken laugh that came out tangled with the tears she'd been holding for 3 years. She sounds terrifying, Abigail said. She was. You'd have loved her. I think I would have. They sat there, hands together, fire dying, stars overhead that neither of them looked at, because everything worth seeing was right in front of them. I ain't asking you for anything, Zeke said. I need you to know that. I ain't asking for anything you don't want to give. What if I want to give it? He looked at her. Then I'll take it, carefully, because anything worth having is worth being careful with. She squeezed his hands. You're a strange man, Ezekiel Turner. So I've been told. Eleanor was right about you. About what? You're not small. You just forgot you were big. Something moved across his face. Not a smile. Something deeper. The tectonic shift of a man whose grief had been a continent, and the continent was finally, slowly, breaking apart to make room for something green. He stood up, still holding one of her hands. He looked at her, all of her, the full, wide, heavy, beautiful, scarred, sunburned, blistered, flower-dusted, fire-tested Oliver, and said, "Come sit on the porch with me." People will talk. Let them. Clarissa Bloom will have a sermon written by morning. Let her. Abigail stood up. All right, but I'm bringing coffee. I'd expect nothing less. They walked to the ranch house porch. She carried 2 cups.
He held the door open. They sat in the two chairs that had been there since Eleanor was alive. The two chairs that Zeke hadn't sat in since the day he'd carried his wife's body out through that same door. He sat in his chair. Abigail sat in Eleanor's. And the chair held her, every pound of her, without complaint, without judgment, like it had been waiting.
They drank coffee and didn't talk, and the silence between them was the richest thing either of them had heard in years. The weeks that followed changed Silver Creek in ways nobody predicted. Abigail set up a permanent cook station at the ranch. She rose before dawn and cooked for the crew and kept the books for supplies and tended the kitchen garden she planted behind the house. Tomatoes, beans, herbs, the yarrow and plantain her grandmother taught her. Word spread. Not Clarissa Bloom's kind of word. The other kind. The kind that travels through taste and touch and the slow recognition that someone in your community is doing good work and it's time to acknowledge it. People started coming to the ranch, not to gawk, to eat. The farmer's wife, her name was Martha Goodwin, came with her daughter to discuss the wedding cake and stayed for supper. She ate Abigail's stew and started crying at the table and said, "This tastes like my mother's kitchen in Ohio before the war." Mr. Dawson started carrying Abigail's pies in the general store. He gave her 60 cents a pie. She made 4 a day. The math changed everything. For the first time in her adult life, Abigail had money that wasn't survival money. It was future money, the kind you put in a jar and don't count every night. Virgil's hand healed clean. The doctor in town, a thin man named Patterson, who wore spectacles and smelled like iodine, examined the scar and said, "Whoever treated this did better work than I could have. Where'd she learn?" "Her grandmother," Virgil said. "Missouri." "Well," Dr. Patterson said, "tell her if she ever wants to assist me on difficult cases, I'd welcome the help." Virgil told her. Abigail said she'd think about it. She thought about it for 1 day. Then she said yes. She started visiting the doctor's office twice a week, treating burns and breaks and fevers, with the same hands that kneaded dough and gripped reins and dragged a man through fire. Doctor. Patterson watched her work and shook his head and said, "You have a gift, Miss Callahan, you know that?" "I have my grandmother's recipes," she said. "The gift was hers." "No," he said, "the recipes were hers. The courage to use them is yours." That stopped her cold. She stood in the doctor's office with a mortar and pestle in her hands and felt the words settle into her bones like medicine. The courage to use them is yours. She carried that sentence home like a lantern. Clarissa Bloom made one last attempt. It came on a Sunday after church. Abigail had started attending, not because she'd forgiven God for the preacher in Abilene, but because Martha Goodwin asked her to sit with the family, and Abigail had discovered that church was bearable when you sat next to people who wanted you there. After the service, Clarissa approached her in the churchyard. No parasol this time, no silk dress. She wore cotton, simple. Her hair was down. She looked, for the first time, like a woman instead of a fortress. "Miss Callahan," she said. "Mrs. Bloom, I owe you an apology." Abigail waited. "I said cruel things about you. I spread stories that weren't true. I tried to turn this town against you because—" She stopped, her hands twisted together. "Because I was jealous." Abigail blinked. "Jealous? Of what you have. Not Zeke, not the ranch. The way you walk into a room and take up space and don't apologize for it. I've spent my whole life making myself smaller. Smaller voice, smaller opinions, smaller appetite. I married Harold because he was safe and small and wouldn't ask me to be anything other than decorative. And then you showed up. You, who are everything I was taught a woman shouldn't be. And you were more alive than I've been in 20 years. Her voice broke. Not dramatically, quietly. The way things break when they've been cracking for a long time and finally reach the part that was holding everything together. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Clarissa said. Abigail looked at this woman, this thin, sharp, silk-wearing, pearl-earring, parasol-carrying woman who had tried to destroy her. And she saw what she'd seen that day in the street. The cage. The prison of performing smallness. The exhausting, lifelong project of taking up less room than you were built for. "I forgive you," Abigail said. Clarissa's eyes widened. "Not because you deserve it," Abigail said. "Because I'm tired of carrying things that don't belong to me. Your cruelty was about you, not me, and I'm giving it back." Clarissa stared at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, turned, walked away. But at the edge of the churchyard, she stopped. "Miss Callahan?" "Yes?" "You make the best pie I've ever tasted, and I've never told you because I bought one secretly from Dawson's store 3 weeks ago and ate it in my kitchen where nobody could see." Abigail almost smiled. "Which flavor?" "Apple." "Try the cherry. It's better." Clarissa nodded, then she walked away. And for the first time, her steps didn't click with the sharp precision of a woman performing confidence. They were softer, slower. The steps of someone learning to walk without armor. Abigail watched her go and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something quieter. The release of a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying until it was gone. Late August. The heat finally broke. Rain came on a Thursday afternoon. Not the violent flash flood kind that had delayed their supplies on the trail, but the gentle, steady kind that soaks the earth and makes everything smell like beginning. Abigail was in the kitchen when it started. She'd moved her cooking inside 2 weeks ago, into the ranch house kitchen that hadn't been properly used since Eleanor died. She'd scrubbed it, reorganized it, hung her pots on the hooks Eleanor had installed, placed her grandmother's skillet on the stove like it had always been there. Zeke came in from the barn, hat dripping, boots muddy. He stopped in the doorway and smelled what she was cooking. Chicken and dumplings. The recipe her grandmother said could cure anything from heartbreak to influenza. And he stood there. "What?" Abigail said. "Nothing, just, the kitchen smells like a kitchen again. That's all." "It was always a kitchen, Zeke." "No, it was a room where a kitchen used to be. There's a difference." She looked at him across the counter. This man, this tall, quiet, grief-scarred, fair-minded, stubborn man who had given her a chance when nobody else would, and then stood in front of his whole town and dared them to see her. "Sit down," she said. "Supper's almost ready." He sat at the table, in his chair. She brought 2 bowls and sat across from him, in Eleanor's chair. They ate. "Abby," he said, halfway through his second bowl. "Yeah? I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer." She set down her spoon. "All right." "Stay." "I am staying. You hired me year-round." "That ain't what I mean." He put his spoon down too. "I mean, stay. Here. At this table. In this house. Not as a cook. Not as a hired hand. As..." He stopped. His jaw worked. The words were fighting again. "As the person who sits in that chair." Abigail felt the air leave the room. "Eleanor's chair," she said. "No," he said. "Yours. It's been yours since the first time you sat in it. I just didn't know how to say it." She looked at her hands on the table. Flour under the nails. Burn scars on the right. A callus on the left thumb from gripping the wagon reins. These hands that had been laughed at and overlooked and underestimated for 27 years. I'm not Eleanor, she said.
I know.
I'm not thin. I'm not beautiful. I'm not—
Stop. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room the way only truth can fill a room. You are beautiful. Not the way the world uses that word. Not the way Clarissa Bloom uses it. Beautiful the way a fire is beautiful when it's the only light in the dark. Beautiful the way bread is beautiful when you're starving. Beautiful the way courage is beautiful when everyone else is running. He reached across the table and took her hand. You are not my past, Abby. You are my present. And if you'll let me, I'd like you to be my future, too. She looked at him through tears she'd finally stopped fighting. 3 years of held-back tears. 3 years of refusing to be soft, because soft meant vulnerable, and vulnerable meant hurt. 3 years of armor that she hadn't even realized she was wearing until this man, this impossible, silent, gentle man, asked her to take it off. Yes, she said. One word, one syllable, the smallest, biggest word she'd ever spoken. Zeke stood up, walked around the table, pulled her to her feet. He looked at her, up close, closer than they'd ever been, and she waited for the thing she always waited for. The flinch, the flicker in his eyes that said he was seeing her body and calculating what it cost him to want her. It didn't come. He cupped her face in his hands, rough hands, rancher's hands, hands that had buried a wife and built a life and held together a cattle drive through fire and drought. And he kissed her. Slow, careful, the way a man kisses a woman he's waited 3 years for without knowing he was waiting. Abigail kissed him back, and the kitchen that had been silent for 3 years was finally, irreversibly, alive. They were married in October. Small ceremony. The ranch. Golden afternoon light falling through the trees that lined the property. Polk stood as witness. Gideon played fiddle, badly, but with so much heart that nobody cared. Tommy Red wore a clean shirt for the first time anyone could remember, and stood in the back and cried openly, and denied it afterward. Virgil brought his mother from Kentucky, a big woman with Virgil's eyes and a laugh that shook the windows. She hugged Abigail so hard that Abigail's feet left the ground, and she whispered, "Thank you for showing my boy what a real woman looks like." Martha Goodwin made the flowers. Dr. Patterson came with his wife. Mr. Dawson closed the store early. Even Mrs. Pearson came. She brought a quilt she'd sewn herself and handed it to Abigail with stiff arms and said, "For the cold nights. The ranch gets drafty in winter." "Thank you, Mrs. Pearson. And if you ever need anything—" The woman's voice cracked. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, walked away fast. Clarissa Bloom sent a cherry pie. Store-bought crust, canned filling, nothing like Abigail's. But the card attached said, "You were right. The cherry is better." Abigail laughed until she cried. Zeke stood beside her through all of it. Not behind her, not in front of her. Beside her. The way a partner stands. The way Eleanor had taught him to stand. Even though it took him 3 years and a fat woman from Missouri with a pie tin to remember. That evening, after the guests were gone and the crew had retired to the bunkhouse and the ranch was quiet, Abigail stood on the porch. The same porch she'd first climbed 9 days before the cattle drive, when she'd knocked on the doorframe with $4.12 to her name and the list of conditions that made Ezekiel Turner's eyebrow rise for the first and only time. Zeke came out and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about my grandmother," she said. "She told me once that the world would try to make me small, that people would look at my body and decide it was the most important thing about me. She said they'd be wrong, but that being wrong wouldn't stop them. Smart woman. She was. She said the only thing I could do was keep making bread, keep feeding people, Keep putting my hands in the dough and letting the work speak for itself." Abigail looked down at her hands. The same hands. Always the same hands. "She was right," Abigail said. "But she left out one thing." "What's that?" "She didn't tell me that someday somebody would taste the bread and see the hands that made it, and love them both." Zeke took her hand, held it, said nothing. Because some truths are too big for words and too important for silence, and the only thing you can do is stand beside the person who spoke them and let the evening hold you both. Abigail May Callahan, the fat woman from Missouri, the pie maker, the trail cook, the healer, the woman who ran into fire, stood on the porch of her home. Her home. Not charity, not gossip, not someone else's kitchen. Hers. She stood with her husband's hand in hers and her grandmother's apron folded on the chair behind her.